It is great to see you guys here this morning. We are continuing our conversation entitled Follow, the story of the Exodus. And as we've been going through, the emphasis that we've had is on the idea that the story of the Exodus really teaches us that to follow Jesus, to follow God, to follow the way of God is to follow into goodness, is to follow into flourishing, is to follow into the blessings of God. To rebel against him is to bring us to a place of destruction. All throughout the story of the Exodus, what you see is over and over and over again. When the Israelites chose to follow God in submission to him and to what he says and to where he directs them, you see him manifesting his power in a way that brings about the good of his people. And every single time they decide that they're going to rebel against him, they land themselves in places where really what gets visited upon them is death. Whether it's the earth opens up or it's snakes coming in or it's a lack of food, whatever it might be. And so the real lesson of this has been when God speaks, when God leads, when God directs, when God gives instruction, if we follow that, goodness follows us. And that's really been the message of the Ten Commandments as we've been going through it, right? As we've been going through the Ten Commandments, we realize that this is not just God attempting to assert his authority over people. It's God's attempt to sow into us that which will be a blessing to us. When we as a people follow his direction in accordance with the Ten Commandments, we realize that God brings for his people a place of flourishing. And so this morning, as we step out of chapter 20, the listing of the Ten Commandments, we will step into what I would see as the deepening of the application of those 10 commandments. Meaning, as we continue to follow, we'll see a deepening of God's blessing for his people. We're not really leaving the law behind. We're stepping deeper into it. Those commands found in chapter 20 were the foundation, the anchor, revealing God's character and principle. What follows now is the application, showing what those same truths look like lived out in everyday life. In other words, God is taking what he declared on the mountain and now showing his people how to reflect it into the world. And it is connected to something that is almost sown into our creation, almost sown into our human existence. There is something in us, deep in us, that longs for justice. We feel it when something is unfair. We feel it when someone is wronged. We feel it when the powerful take advantage of the weak. And yet, at the same time, it's not exactly sown into our existence. Because we also live in a world where justice is constantly redefined. What one group calls justice, another calls oppression. What one culture celebrates, another condemns. So the question with which we are ultimately wrestling with is who gets to define justice? Because if justice is simply a human construct, it will always shift. It will always bend towards power. It will always be inconsistent. But what we see in Exodus chapters 21 through 23 is something radically different. God doesn't just command justice, he reveals what justice looks like amongst people who are meant to reveal his nature. God's justice is not rooted in cultural preference. It's rooted in his character. David Guzda describes the laws expressed in chapters 21 through 23 like this. He says, God's law reveals his nature. It shows us that he is just and fair and concerned with how people treat one another. So these laws that we review are not random. They're not arbitrary. They're not simply rules for an ancient society, but they provide a window into the heart of God, and that's why it's relevant for us today. As we go through this, you'll discover that at the heart of this is a revelation of who God is, and that revelation is necessary for us as followers of Jesus Christ to really understand. The rules here show us what it looks like when a people who have been redeemed begin to live in a way that reflects the God who redeemed them. Living in a way that quite often is very different than the world in which they live. And that's critical for us to understand, because God did not give these laws to create his people. He gave these laws to shape his people. What's so important to remember as we've gone through all of these stories, as we've reflected on the existence of the Israelites in this place, is that the redemption came first. The relationship came first. He redeemed them from their slavery, established relationship with them, and then gave them instruction. So what we're reading here is this. What does life look like when God's people reflect God's character in a real world? So as we venture into this, I want you to keep that in mind. This is what we, as followers of God, are meant to look like. And the window that we see here is into his character that we're supposed to reflect. Now, instead of reading all 3 chapters, which would cause us to get really bogged down in a lot of the minutia of how they are to live their lives, we're going to read some key portions that I think capture the heart of what God is establishing. And as I read through this, I want you to see the broad principles that are being imposed as they reveal the character of God. Starting in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 12. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hands, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Chapter 22, he says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. And then Exodus 23. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. as you hear those laws, it can feel like a lot of detail. But underneath all of it, there is a consistent thread. It is the declaration that this is what God is like. Justice, the value of life, proportional response, responsibility, restitution, protection of the vulnerable, mercy, and even grace towards the enemy. If we are going to follow him, this is what we must become. And so the first lesson to be learned about the nature of God from these laws is that it's to be applied to our lives is God's justice values every human life. What we see first in the passage we read following Exodus chapter 20 is that God establishes a justice system that clearly reflects the value that is spelled out by the fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder. God is establishing a system that places immense value on human life. There are laws here about violence. There are laws about injury. There are laws even about accidental harm. And what becomes clear very quickly is this. Life is not treated casually. Why? Because justice is not rooted in circumstances. It is rooted in God's character. And God is the one who creates life. And God is the one who sustains life. And God deeply values life. This is an obvious overflow from the command, you shall not murder. We said in that discussion how God declares so clearly that the idea, that the principle behind thou shalt not murder is the preciousness of life. In fact, in Genesis, it describes exactly why that life is so precious. When it says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. As we talked about this, what we realize is God is making the declaration, I made man in my own image. That each one of us is an image bearer of God, and therefore, as a result of that, God says their life is to be precious. It is not to be something that is to be taken lightly. It is not to be something that is dismissed easily. Life is precious because I made every single life in my image. So when God establishes laws that protect life, he's not just creating social order, he is defending his own image in humanity. That's why even in these ancient laws, there are distinctions made. Intentional violence versus accidental harm, premeditation versus negligence. Because God is just, and his justice is not reckless. It is measured, and it is thoughtful, and it is rooted in truth. The truth that life is precious. Even the phrase, an eye for an eye, which I think has been misunderstood so often, was never about revenge. It was about limiting retaliation. It was about God saying justice must be proportional, not escalated. Why? Because that reflects his character. The character of just response in the name of the preservation of life. If you remember, we talked about this when we discussed the commandment against murder. Jesus picks this up and he deepens it even further in Matthew chapter 5. He says, you have heard it said, one who commits murder is subject to death. But if you are unjustly angry or you insult another, you are subject to judgment. Why? Because the issue is not just murder. It's anger. It's contempt. It is what's happening in the heart towards the life of the one in front of you. It is teaching us and sowing into us that life is so precious that you shouldn't be dismissive of it, that you shouldn't be hateful towards it. God cherishes life. And so we must also. And this speaks directly into our world today. Because we live in a culture that increasingly assigns value to life based on usefulness, stage of development, quality of life. But Scripture teaches us the opposite. God's justice is rooted in His character. So therefore, every life carries dignity. When that is not the case, when the value of life is not rooted in something that is transcendent, a people, a society, and a culture drift into a place in which life at some point gets defined by degrees. This is who God is. He is just. He provides for us the foundation for our own justice. And every life carries worth. And once life is valued properly, it establishes the foundation for everything that is to follow. Because true justice then becomes rooted in the value of human life. Because we don't just ask, did something wrong happen? We ask, who was affected? What life was impacted? And how do we make it right? Because it's not about something, it's about someone. It's about people whose lives are to be valued. And as a result, God's justice establishes responsibility for our actions. These next laws move from violence to everyday life. Oxen falling into pits, property damage, theft. And it might feel almost mundane, but it is deeply theological. Because what God is establishing is this. Justice is not just about avoiding wrong. It is about taking responsibility when wrong happens. If your negligence harms someone, you are responsible. If you take something, you restore it. If you damage something, you repair it. Why? Why is this sewn into the laws? It's because this reflects the character of God. God does not ignore wrongdoing. I want you to hear that, and I want you to hear that again. God does not ignore wrongdoing. The reason why I want to repeat that is because I think so many of us live in the glow of our salvation, and we lose sight of the fact that God does not ignore your wrongdoing. We have been the recipients of God's great mercy. We have been the recipients of God's grace in our lives. We have been the recipients of a love that is unconditional. But I want you to understand, at the core of the gospel message is the fact that God does not ignore wrongdoing. He doesn't just dismiss the consequences thereof. Our wrongdoing is not ignored. There are consequences demanded by God for our wrongdoing. How do I know that? Because Jesus had to die. That's one of the things that I think we lose sight of. We feel as though it doesn't really matter what we've done. It doesn't really matter what we do because you know what? We've just been forgiven. But that forgiveness was bought with an incredibly high price. The death of Jesus Christ. Why? Because the character of God does not ignore wrongdoing. He enforces the consequences of our wrongdoing. Now, by grace and mercy, Jesus Christ became the payment for our sin. But don't ever think that it's okay. Don't ever think that it's cheap. Don't ever think that there are no consequences. Because God holds us responsible. And that responsibility was laid on Jesus Christ. God deals with it. But notice something about it. The goal is not punishment. The goal is restoration. The message established in these laws means when wrong is done, we strive to bring restoration. The goal is to make things right. It's interesting because the effect of coming to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, of coming to the knowledge of the nature of God, should inspire that. One of the places this is evidenced is in the story that is recorded in Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus. When he encounters Jesus, he doesn't just say, "I'm forgiven." He says, "I will restore fourfold." Why? Because when you encounter the God of justice, you begin to reflect on his character and desire to see the restoration of that which you've done come to pass. And that is the call of the gospel in our lives. We love the idea of forgiveness, but we are often resistant to responsibility. We want grace without ownership, but God's justice, because it is rooted in his character, calls us to higher. Grace forgives, but transformation takes responsibility. We naturally want the benefits of grace. We want forgiveness. We want freedom from guilt. We want a clean slate without embracing the responsibility that transformation requires. But because God's justice flows from his character, he doesn't just remove guilt. He reshapes the person. And that character is a calling to each one of us. We are called to the responsibility of our wrongdoing. It's why we're called to make things right with our brothers. Why in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us before we can even worship, we need to first be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Why Romans 12 says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. The instruction there is, if there has been wrongdoing, if there is a problem between you and a brother, make it right. Live peaceably with one another. That's why Colossians 3 says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Each of these is a call to the responsibility of restoration when we have wronged one another. So yes, grace forgives what we've done. But real transformation means we also own the impact of what we've done and pursue making it right whenever possible. And that responsibility is not applied equally in a vacuum. Because God's justice pays special attention to something else. God's justice defends the vulnerable and demands mercy. This may be the most revealing section of all. Because over and over again, God brings attention to the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, and the poor. And he says, do not exploit them, do not oppress them, do not take advantage of them. And then he gives the reason. Because you were once strangers in Egypt. That is an idea that I want you to carry with you through the rest of this morning's message. Because sewn into it is a deeply important truth. God is saying, you were once in that same place. You were once a stranger. You were once a sojourner. You were once despised. You were once enslaved. Remember that. And even more importantly, remember what I did for you when you were in that place. And reflect on it as you treat others. God in this is bringing us back to who He is and how He deals with people. God's justice is not cold. It is not detached. It is not indifferent. It is deeply personal because it flows from His character. God is not neutral towards injustice. He says, if they cry out to me, I will hear. Why? Because He is compassionate. And man, He takes it to a very far degree. In Exodus 23, God says, if you see your enemy's ox, help him. If you see someone you hate struggling, step in. You understand what's revealed here? What is being revealed here is not human justice, it is divine justice. Jesus echoes this in Matthew chapter 5, where He says, love your enemies. Why? Because that is what God is like toward you. Consider Romans chapter 5 as it describes God's heart in the gospel. It said, God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by His blood, much more shall we be saved by Him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son. I want to return you back to the declaration where He says, remember what you were in Egypt. This is the reminder for us. Remember the mercy and the grace that was given to you while you were still a sinner and you were an enemy of God. You see, this is a reflection of what He has done for you. This is a reflection of what He has done for me. This is a reflection of His nature where He says, listen, I am not waiting for you to make things right. I will make things right. Even when you were a sinner and you were an enemy. Understand something. This is the test of whether we truly understand God's justice. Because when we understand His forgiveness to us in such a way that we extend that forgiveness towards others, we get it. When we understand His mercy towards us in such a way that we extend that mercy towards others, that we understand His patience, His long suffering towards us in such a deep way that we extend patience and long suffering towards others. Do you know that God is long suffering with you? Let me ask you that again. Do you know that God is long suffering with you? And I love the phrase, I love the idea. It's the way in which the Bible describes patience. He suffers longly with you and me. I can look back on my walk with Jesus Christ and I can see where even after His mercy and His grace has been extended to me, how I know deeply His salvation work in my life. And yet I know that I screw up. I know that I deny Him. I know that I turn my back on Him. And you know what He does? He suffers longly with me. Are you long suffering? Do you look at those around you, even those who you see as an enemy, as you see somebody who is in opposition to you, and do you have patience for them? This for me is such an important thing for us as Christians to consistently reflect upon. Because when he has been gracious to us, we need to be gracious to others. And it's interesting where this goes. It can feel disjointed, but where the text leads next is essential to be able to sustain this embodiment of godly justice. And I want you to hear what I mean by that. You are called to that divine mercy and that divine grace that is not a part of who you are. How are you able to do that? How are we able to sustain that in our lives? And what we see is that God's covenant establishes rhythms that cause us to sustain his justice. Look at where these 3 chapters ultimately land. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. 3 times in a year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of the unleavened bread as I commanded you, and you shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Ahab. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. When you read this, the final section shifts. It shifts to Sabbath. It shifts to feasts. It shifts us to the commemoration of trusting God for provision, of remembering God's promising to go before them. And as I say, this might feel disconnected, but it's not, because here is what God is showing us. Justice is not sustained by laws alone. It is sustained by lives that are aligned with him. You cannot live justly if you do not trust God. You cannot show mercy if you are not resting in his mercy. You cannot reflect his character if you are not walking with him. I want you to understand this, because this is something that I believe very deeply as followers of Christ. And one of the reasons why I think we struggle so much to live this out. The call of God is to something divine. How many in and of yourself think you are divine? The call of Christ is to something that is beyond our own humanity. And so unless we deeply understand, unless we deeply live in the place of remembering who he is for us, it's difficult to live that out. What do I mean by that? Listen, if I don't know that God is my provision, it becomes very difficult for me to sacrificially provide for others. But when I know that God has promised to take care of me, that he's going to supply all my needs, that he will meet my needs, I can live graciously and give to others knowing that he's my provision. When I know that he is ultimately my protector, I can be graciously forgiving towards others without having to worry to protect myself. My own self-interests are not something that I have to be concerned with, because I know that he's going to take care of me. And what tends to happen in our walk is when we lose sight of the reality of who he is, what he's done, what he's promised to do, we revert back to our human frailty. We revert back to our human protection. And so what we see revealed in this is God is saying, I want you to continue to remember I want you to come to the Sabbath and remember that I took care of you and that it's not in your laboring in which you are going to survive. I want you to come back to the feast and I want you to remember what I've done for you. And in that, we become anchored and are able to live what the law demands. The rhythms described here, Sabbath and worship and remembrance, they're designed to recalibrate the heart. They remind us that God is provider, God is judge, God is faithful. And when that is settled, everything else flows out from it. The rhythms God establishes, rest and remembrance and worship, aren't just disciplines. They are the means by which we are continually reminded of who He is towards us. This is why the epistles go to great lengths to remind us. As Ephesians says, we forgive as God in Christ forgave you. And as Colossians echoes when it says, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. As 1 Peter reminds us, as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in your conduct. And as 2 Corinthians shows us, God comforts us in all our affliction so that we may be able to comfort others. In other words, these rhythms keep us anchored in the revelation of God's character so that His justice and mercy are not just understood, but sustained and expressed through our lives. The clear message here is that we, as the people of God, are meant to magnify the nature of God. His mercy, His forgiveness, His holiness, His justice. And that is because that nature is fully revealed in His Son through His gospel work. Understand what I'm saying. We are Christians. We are Christians, and as a result of that, we are followers of Christ. We are Christians, and as a result of that, we are to be magnifiers of His very nature. We are Christians, and as a result of that, we are to be ambassadors of His character. And Christ is the full embodiment of the nature of God. When we look at these laws that are spelled out here, we are looking at the nature of God, and from there, Christ lives Him out. Christ reveals Him, and we are called to reveal Christ. So it is in understanding the nature of God, we are able to understand who Christ is, and we are able to then live Him out. As Christians, we are little Christ. And Colossians 1 tells us that Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in Him all the fullness of God is pleased to dwell. And Hebrews draws it even closer to the nature of God when it says, in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. The work of the gospel towards you is the just and holy and merciful nature of God revealed in His law. And so we are called to continue that by being empowered through indwelling in Him, bringing the beauty of God in Christ to the world around us. I tell you this morning, if you are struggling to love as He loved, to live as He lived, to forgive as He forgave, to be at peace as He is peace, we need to look to the work of God in Christ that has been done for you. If you are disconnected from that reality, if you're struggling to live out Christ in that way, My encouragement to you this morning is to set your eyes and your heart and your mind on all of Him that has been given to you. This is where we lose sight of it all. In all the years that I've been a Christian, all the years that I've followed Him, and all the years I've been in church ministry and interacted with people, the deficit in our living out Jesus is we've lost track of how Jesus has been manifested in us. He loves you like no other. He forgives you. He's merciful towards you. He's gracious towards you. He is establishing you. Do you know that? Do you believe that? Live in that understanding. And I promise you, the nature of God in Christ will be manifested in your life.